live.
Excellent, and what a great video. Thank you. So welcome back to the next session, the next exciting session. We have now Nick Gillespie will be interviewing Dr. Jo Jorgensen, the Libertarian Party's presidential candidate in the upcoming US presidential election. So great stuff. You don't want to hear from us, you want to hear from them. So Nick Gillespie, who has been to Australia for a Friedman conference before, and we will eventually coax him to come back again and again. And again, Nick, you've been warned.
I wanted to. Your government keeps telling me that for some reason I don't meet the basic competency and decency test.
This whole government idea is a bad idea. I don't think
I'm going to have to sneak in. But I'll be back, whether you like it or not.
So Nick is the editor-at-large at Reason, and he's now going to take over. I'm going to hide in the background and take it away, Nick.
Thank you, John. And it's a real pleasure to be talking to Jo Jorgensen, Dr. Jo Jorgensen, who is a senior or a lecturer in psychology at Clemson University and the presidential candidate, presidential nominee for the Libertarian Party. Back in 1996, she was the vice presidential nominee. So congratulations on the promotion, Jo Jorgensen. Let's get right to it. This is the weirdest moment. I can't speak for Australia, but in American history, I was born in 1963. There has never been a year that is weirder than 2020, and we are barely in the middle of it. Tell me, as you're running for president, what is your large vision for the country? What is the message that your campaign is trying to send?
Well, first, let me say it's an honor to be interviewed by you. I've been a longtime fan of Reason. So thank you for your work for freedom. And I think my vision is actually your vision for freedom, which is people being able to make their own decisions, being able to spend their own money and living peacefully, as opposed to federal bureaucrats, politicians, and lobbyists making decisions for us and spending our money a heck of a lot worse than we would spend our own.
There are arguably, it's bigger than this, but there are at least three major issues that, and crises really, that are facing the country right now. I would say that includes the kind of racial protests or racially tinged or protests about racially charged policing and a reset of race relations in America that is, again, is unique in my lifetime. I don't remember the 60s protests, but this is a real moment for that, and also a real moment for kind of police reform and criminal justice reform. There is the COVID-19 pandemic, and there is an economic collapse, essentially, or lockdown, which is, really the worst, absolutely the worst economic situation since the Great Depression. I mean, this is making the financial crisis look like a minor market correction. Let's start with the COVID-19 pandemic. You are running for president. What has Donald Trump and the federal government and the governors of various states done wrong, and how would you approach what is going on here? How do we deal with something like this from a libertarian perspective?
Well, first of all, the government's approach to this, their response, is basically the largest assault on our liberty that I've seen in my lifetime. I completely agree with you. And they've made mistakes on a couple different fronts, both personal freedoms and economic freedoms. One problem that Trump, one major mistake that he made was not getting the FDA out of the way of testing. A lot of people don't realize what a huge obstacle the FDA is to not only bringing testing to the market, but drugs and everything else. And he should have used his Emergency Powers Act to allow these testing kits to get out there. There were over 60 different companies, American companies, making testing kits, and yet the FDA only approved 2 of them initially. And a lot of the media was pointing out how, hey, look over in South Asia. Notice how well they're testing everybody, how extensive their testing is. Yeah, they were testing their citizens with kits made in our country that we weren't allowed to use. And if we had found out early on who was sick, who wasn't, then we would have known who needed to stay home and who didn't need to stay home. Especially because so many people with the disease were asymptomatic. So we needed more extensive testing. And then the fact that he put us all under house arrest, that we lost tens of millions of jobs, is just obscene. And a lot of people point to, well, but those were the governors. Yeah, but because President Trump had the bully pulpit with Dr. Fauci sitting next to him saying, we need to shut this place down.
Were there governors or local leaders, I guess, or other voices in the federal government that you think did a better job? And I guess this is a roundabout way of asking, is this the type of situation where you can devolve the decision making down to the individual? I think rightly that a lot of people question, in a pandemic, what this is a place where if the federal government has a role to play, this is one where they would kind of flex. How much of decision making should go down to either the state, local, or individual level?
Well, for a pandemic such as this, which has a 98% survival rate, I would suggest that the government has no business being anywhere near it. Now, is it fine for the president to get up and say, this is serious? And look, you need to stay home if you're vulnerable? Absolutely. But I'd like to point out that what the government did is just basically get in the way. And as far as what the government's role is, it's not to really tell us who can be going out to work and who can't be. So it would be more. You would say that it should be. The government might act as a broker of information, and in certain circumstances limit what our activities can be. But that the idea of this overwhelming shutdown, whether it's done by the federal government or local or state governments, has been a mistake. Oh, yeah. And in fact, a lot of people have the mistaken impression that if the government doesn't do it, it doesn't get done. That if government doesn't tell you to do the right thing, that it's not going to get done. But polls a couple months ago showed, well, they asked people, do you think it's too early to open up? Something like 70 to 80% of the people in the polls said, yes, it is too early. So they didn't need government to be their mom and dad telling them to stay home. They understood this is serious. And once again, we've got the government in the way. Also, I'd like to point out one of the reasons that Dr. Fauci told us that we needed to stay locked up and not spread the virus is that we didn't have the hospitals to help to take care of everybody. Well, again, here's the question. Why don't we have enough hospitals to take care of everybody? Because we've got certificate of need laws and other laws restricting medical care. So the government is basically deciding how many hospitals, how many clinics, how many doctors, how many nurses, and that should be left up to the free market. And a lot of people don't realize, for instance, you can't even build a clinic. Let's say you want a 24-hour clinic where instead of going to the expensive emergency room, you get to bring your sick kid in at 10 o'clock at night for a much cheaper price. A lot of people don't realize you can't even build a clinic like that without approval from the government. Why not let people build clinics? And if they go bankrupt, let them go bankrupt. That shouldn't be the decision of the federal government. They're obviously not the ones who have the best foresight.
Let's talk about the nationwide protests in the United States, and they've been mirrored or joined by demonstrations certainly in Europe. I don't know about in Oceania or the Anzac countries, but in the protests in the wake of the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and there were a couple of recent cases, Breonna Taylor in Louisville and whatnot, that sparked this. There has been a broad call for, in the name of Black Lives Matter, which is both a broad kind of general movement and also a very specific organization. And I want to get into the distinctions between those later. But there have been discussions about abolishing the police, about defunding the police, and things like that. Where do you stand on how is law enforcement doing, and what has been revealed in your mind, by the killing of George Floyd and the protests that have come afterwards?
Well, I would say part of this has to do with the federal government being where it doesn't belong. So if you look at crime, whether it's assault, robbery, burglary, whatever, that's a local issue, and the policing should be determined among the mayor, city council, police, taxpayers, voters, not the federal government. And what we've had the federal government militarizing our local police departments by giving them tanks, grenade launchers, and so forth. So now the police, instead of having this, like it says on the side of the cop car, to serve and protect and community and all that, which is the way it should be. Now, instead of having that attitude, now they've got the attitude of soldiers because the federal government has been getting involved and militarizing them. And I don't want to be at war with other countries. I certainly don't want to be at war with America's own citizens. So if the federal government had not gotten involved, they wouldn't have this heavy arsenal at their disposal, and they wouldn't be so quick to use it. And so I think it has just changed the mentality.
Can I, ask you to because you've tweeted a lot in favor of Black Lives Matter. There is a particular group, a nonprofit called Black Lives Matter. The leadership of that is explicitly anti-capitalist. They say that America is filled with systemic racism, and or is a white supremacist country. That everything that's going on in the country is actually geared towards the subjugation of people of color. And in the interest of maintaining the higher level of white status in America. Do you buy into that critique, or where do you differ from that?
Well, I agree that there has been systemic racism. And one of the things that I've pointed out to people, so we've all heard the story of Rosa Parks, how she was a heroic Black woman who refused to sit on the back of the bus. The second part of the story that most people don't know is that was a government-run, government-owned bus. And that kind of racism could not have lasted, let's say, in the free market. There were about 60% of the ridership were Blacks. So let's take it today. Let's look at Uber. What if Uber discriminated against the best 60% of their customers? They would go out of business, as well they should. But the federal government gets to stay in business because they've got the power, and they've got the power to discriminate. And then if they don't do something right, they simply raise taxes and spend more money. So if we look at drug laws, they hurt the Black community much more than whites. They get pulled over more often, they get checked more often, and even the sentencing. The drugs that people of color use have longer prison sentence than the drugs that whites use. So yes, there is systemic racism in there, and Black Lives Matter, because they've had all these tragic deaths. They are in mourning. I realize that they are very upset. And I would say that we share many ideas with them, such as ending qualified immunity, police brutality, sentencing disparities. These are all things that we've been talking about for 40 years, and especially the war on drugs. So I would like to talk with them and look at the ideas that we share to expose them to the rest of the country. And I've met with Black Lives Matters leaders, and they are very open to the idea of, how about we get to keep our money and we get to make our own decisions. And last, I'd like to point out, and I did mention this to a Black Lives Matter leader who wasn't aware of this. So this is a great opportunity for us to reach people, which is that although Blacks have traditionally voted Democrat, whenever there's a referendum where they're voting on the actual topic, they tend to vote more free market. So Blacks tend to be more religious, they tend to be family oriented, and they do understand economic freedom. Unfortunately, the Democratic Party has basically taken over their vote, and now that they're showing that they're taking it for granted, as in Joe Biden's interview with Charlemagne, now I think it's a great opportunity for them to join our movement.
Are you what kinds of the libertarian movement, and like you, I've been involved in the you have a longer lineage in it than I do, but I've been involved for 25 plus years. The libertarian movement often gets knocked for being largely white, largely male, present company excluded, and what are the country, the younger generation? We're both we're both on the wrong side of 50, let's say. We're both on the wrong side of 30. The country is both getting younger, but it's getting more multi-ethnic. It is getting more diverse geographically, demographically, in every which way. what do you do to appeal to younger voters? Because, right now you are, one of the great things that you can say is you are, by a decade or more, you're the youngest major party presidential nominee. What are you doing to reach young voters who look different than the America that you and I grew up in?
Right. First of all, social media is key. And we've had a very successful social media campaign, and we are reaching the younger people. Also, I'd like to point out that my running mate is a millennial, and he's going to be probably the youngest.
And he'll be waking up within an hour, really. So, and eating avocado toast. So maybe we'll get to him later, but.
Well, I have no room to speak because I'm a night owl myself. But what we're finding is just overwhelming support from younger people on social media. And one of the things that we've been somewhat surprised about, but overly ecstatic, is that the majority of our volunteers have come from outside the Libertarian Party. And that's the way it's been from the start. And that's pretty unusual. Usually with the Libertarian campaign, you start with your core supporters, and as you introduce people to the concept, they jump on board. We've had non-libertarians from the start, and it's just been so exciting. And if I can tell you I went to Oklahoma recently, and in less than 24 hours, they put together an event. They said, hey, Joe Jorgensen's going to have a meet and greet at this restaurant. The restaurant was filled to capacity, and there were about 30 people waiting in line outside the door in 90-degree heat. And one of my most vocal supporters there was a woman who'd never even heard of me more than a week before. And my Oklahoma state coordinator said, oh, yes, most of the people I'm getting in, they're all non-libertarians. So we are reaching these other demographics, and I'm so excited to do that.
I would like to come back to the kind of mechanics or logistics of your campaign, which of course is, again, part of the weirdness of the current moment is just, even Joe Biden is, locked in his basement, possibly because he forgot the combination to get out or something. But let's talk about the economic situation here. We have had, in the past 3 or 4 months, we turned off the economy. Somebody flipped a kill switch, and we had record levels of people filing for unemployment, record numbers of permanent job loss. What is your solution to the current moment? The federal Congress, and Donald Trump has signed off on this, has pumped trillions of dollars of money to people. Is that the right thing, or what is the proper Libertarian Party response to what's going on right now?
That is the biggest mistake. That's the worst thing you could do. The research is clear. When private industry has the money instead of government, the private industry creates twice as many jobs as the government does. So we need to keep the money in the private industry. Secondly, by keeping it in the private industry, people get to choose where they want their money to go. And if we look at who was hurt, a lot of large corporations were not hurt nearly as bad as the small mom and pop stores. So by keeping the money in the community, people can be supporting their local businesses. And also, I'd like to point out that with regard to where the money is going, first of all, it's going to airline companies. Well, and people say, well, but we have to have airline travel. Well, the planes aren't going to disappear. Perhaps the previous companies didn't run them well enough. Perhaps it is time to let somebody else take over. But anytime we give money to these large corporations, that money has to come from somewhere. It's not Donald Trump, it's not Nancy Pelosi pulling money out of their back pocket and giving it to them. It's our money, and I would suggest we can do a much better job of spending the money and getting it to the right companies who work for our business, who give us the best quality and the best price for what we're shopping for.
So, part of your campaign to win the Libertarian Party nomination was that you are not an anarchist. You talked about being pragmatic and realistic and kind of incremental. Embedded in your answer is the presumption that the government should be doing a lot right now to help people who are unemployed or thrown out of work. Talk a little bit about your philosophical underpinnings. Of how much money should the government? The government is the federal government in the United States is augmenting unemployment insurance by about $600 a week. That goes on top of state unemployment. Is that a good idea? And is the question not whether the government should be intervening in the economy now, but rather how and how much?
Yeah, so of course the government can't spend money better than individuals. One of the biggest lessons I learned when I was younger was the reason the Soviet Union was failing. And you're right, I'm slightly older than you are, so we still had the Soviet Union at the time.
I remember the Soviets, and I think I speak for a lot of people almost fondly, because it was horrible, and obviously the people living under the yoke of communism were miserable, but it did structure our world in a way that seems, almost preferable to whatever the hell's going on now. But please continue.
It's kind of Rockwellian, isn't it? The good old Norman Rockwell days of the Soviet Union, as opposed to what's going on now. But
terrible, terrible freedom.
Yes. So the way I was explained was, central planning doesn't work. That in Russia, if they've got steel, they've got people in the capital deciding where should the steel go? Should it go to make cars, or should it go to make refrigerators? And it's hard to plan that way. The reason the United States capitalism works, not crony capitalism, but capitalism, the reason the United States capitalism works is because we've got a price system. So who's willing to pay more for the steel? If the refrigerator companies are backed up and they need more steel, then they'll pay a higher price. That's where the steel goes to. If the car companies have back orders and they need the steel, they'll pay higher prices. So through the free market, you can look at money as an information system. And so I would say anytime the money goes to the federal government, it's not going to be used as well as a system that's a bottom up. Top down usually doesn't work as well as bottom up when it comes. But
should I know my answer, and I'm probably to the left of you on this. I'm not sure, but should the government be helping people who have been thrown out of work, and in what ways? I think most libertarians would say it shouldn't. The airline companies, Spirit Airline, if anybody anybody who has flown on Spirit wants that company to go out of business. So they shouldn't get the money, but should we be helping people out through through cash payments, because we're in a moment where the economy is tanked, many people have lost their jobs, and if so, how do we figure out how much money? From if you were president, you would be in that discussion.
Well, you make an excellent point, and I've never flown on Spirit, but the point is, when government decides where to spend the money, they go to the people who gave them campaign contributions, to their lobbyists. Whereas I, as a consumer, I can decide, I don't want my money to go to that particular airline because they don't treat me well. I want my money to go to this particular airline. So why not let us? Because remember, when they give cash payouts to those companies, the money is coming from somewhere. So let us keep the money and let us decide which airline should stay in business and which airline shouldn't. So that would be my answer to that.
What your website? Yeah.
Do you mind if I give a part two? Because you said you might be a little to the left of me, and I think maybe you're getting on kind of the moral, shouldn't we help people out? And one of my favorite examples is the United Way in the early 90s. The CEO went out and bought $400,000 worth of artwork and was raked over the coals. And by the way, $400,000 then is close to $1 million right now. And what happened? Donations dried up. The donors said, you know what? We want our money to go to the poor people. We don't want the money to go to your fancy artwork. And so United Way had to basically work their butts off to get that trust back, to show we're spending that money well. Okay, what about that same money going to the government? What if the government has high overhead? We don't get to have a voice. The government has no accountability. They get to waste our money, and the money doesn't get to who needs it. And in fact, I had heard a statistic before I heard of the Libertarian Party that if you want to get $1, and so this is in the 70s, it's changed by then, but it's a good representation. If you want to get $1 from the person who's giving it to the person in need, it costs maybe 10 cents to go through a church for overhead. It costs maybe about 35 cents for a private charity. such as United Way. But for the federal government to get $1 from the person who wants to give it to the person in suggest that that is the immoral way. And last, I'd like to point out, if you had, let's say, you get an inheritance, $10,000, you want to give it to those in need. Because let's say you're doing well off, you're comfortably. You look around, do you want to give it to this charity, that charity? Where are you going to decide to spend your money? Here's the question. Do you want to give it to your church, or do you want to give it to a federal government program? And most people laugh at the idea, like, oh my gosh. And even Bill Gates and Oprah Winfrey, who keep saying, yes, I want the government to take more of my money. Even Bill Gates has created the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. If he thought the federal government could spend the money more, better than he could, why isn't he just giving the money to the federal government? So that's a strong and clear message that he thinks that he can get the money to those who need it better than the federal government, and I agree with him.
One of the issues that we write a lot about at Reason magazine, Reason.com, and I know it's all over your site as well, is the amount of national debt in the United States. And this is something that, echoes throughout every developed country. We have $23 trillion in national debt. Our debt is bigger than the economy at this point by most measures, and that's only going to continue. We've almost doubled the federal budget this year, and we still got 3 months to go. Why is the national debt a bad thing? The traditional critiques that came from libertarian economists such as Milton Friedman, is that the national debt is going to cause inflation. It's going to crowd out private lending, et cetera. Has that happened, or why should we worry, especially in an age now? And I guess this is, a question as you're running for, as a libertarian, at a moment when things are up for grabs, but we have, a new economic theory called modern monetary theory, which says that basically as long as the United States is the reserve currency, just print away. Why is the national debt? Why should we care about the national debt?
Well, eventually somebody has to pay the bill. And I would suggest that it is immoral to put the bill on our children and grandchildren. And inflation is a problem with it. Inflation is real, and we have seen it. And it's just, it's a sense of basically personal responsibility. Why would a family making $30,000 a year, let's say, run up a tab of $200,000? Eventually, you're going to get to a point to where it can't be paid. So how can it be paid?
Mm-hmm. You were on the 1996 presidential ticket, right, for the Libertarian Party with Harry Brown?
Yes, 1996. Yeah. I was on the ballot in all 50 states, yes. Okay. And can I mention, you were just talking about the debt. Can I point out that the debt was somewhere around $5 million back then? The debt has gone, it's 5 times the size it used to be, almost 5 times the size it used to be. And if we keep at this rate, then it's going to be getting even worse. So.
A lot. Well, one of the why I brought that up is partly in. Do you think America is as free a country as it was in 1996? Are we freer? Are we less free? Give a sense of what's happened in that, this past 24, 25 years.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would suggest we're less free just from the looking at the debt, the fact that now we all owe money and we can't spend our money on what we want it spent on, that basically the government's going to be taking more money to pay that back. So on some of the left issues, such as marijuana and gay marriage, I would say freedom has been winning. And I'd like to make a real quick note. A lot of people don't realize that as late as 2012, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton were still against gay marriage. A lot of people think, well, the Democratic Party, they're for individual freedoms. The Libertarian Party has been for gay marriage since 1972. And yet, 40 years later, they finally catch on. And I'd like to point out that the free market does a better job with that as well, in the fact that Disney, the Disney Corporation, in the early 90s, while I was running for VP, I would point out in the early 90s, hey, the federal government still thinks you shouldn't be married, but guess what? Disney Corporation gives benefits to partners of their gay employees, because they understand that in order to compete for the best employees, in order to service your customers, you have to meet their needs. And so I'd like to point out that the federal government has finally caught up to the Libertarian Party and the free market with respect to gay marriage. But overall, I would say government, big government is winning. Spending keeps piling up. Taxes keep piling up. And worst of all, now we're in endless wars. We weren't talking too much about war in 1996, and now it's just atrocious. We've had the war on terror. We've got soldiers fighting in the war on terror who weren't even alive when it started.
Yeah. We'll talk a little bit about what your foreign policy orientation is. Libertarians often get knocked as being isolationists. Is that a badge of shame, or is that something we should, or that you embrace, or how would you conduct foreign policy?
Well, my slogan for foreign policy is that I'd like to turn America into one giant Switzerland, armed and neutral. And I point that out to point out that it is not isolationism. Switzerland is not isolationist. They have tourism. They're a big banking center. People come in and out of the country. And what I'd like to also point out is what helps the most with foreign policy and preventing wars is to having free and open trade. So if we look at, well, let me tell you a quick story, something that happened to me in the early 80s. I was driving a Fiat Spider, and I drove into a parking lot, and this older gentleman walked over to me, and he was just scowling. And I thought, geez, I don't think I cut him off. I'm not sure why he's so upset with me. Well, he got closer, and he's just glaring at my car. And he explained that he was a World War II veteran, and how dare I buy a car from Italy. Now, being a veteran, I so admire and am grateful for his service to his country. I didn't even want to get into a debate, let alone an argument. But what I would have explained is, look, if we buy cars from Italy, they're not going to bomb us. And one of the reasons why we don't have to worry about Japan bombing us again is we buy so many Toyotas and Hondas. You tend to not bomb your best customer. So I would say that free trade with no tariffs, which is what I'm advocating, is about as far as you can get from an isolationist policy. That is,
I mean, just to engage you a little bit on this, and this is kind of a question, what has changed over the past, 50 years, 30 years, 20 years. That position, free trade, and it's interesting to think about Bill Clinton in the early 90s. I mean, he was the final salesman. He and Al Gore dragged NAFTA and a kind of a belief in free trade or freer trade across the finish line. Democrats believed in it. Republicans did. Hardly anybody does anymore. What has happened? Because, Donald Trump is, he ran as a protectionist. He acts kind of as a protectionist. Bernie Sanders, who has had a major role in defining the Democratic platform, both for Joe Biden, they just released a joint document, but the sensibility, they are pro-free trade. What is the argument for free trade in a world where increasing numbers of people, certainly in the United States, are saying, free trade has led us to a country with no jobs, service sector jobs that are terrible, and China is not only making our lunch, but they're, in selling it to us, they're eating it as well.
Well, first you mentioned Bill Clinton and the 90s. I'd like to say one thing that I'm so glad we got rid of, that we don't hear anymore, is the term fair trade. Because when I hear fair trade, my question is fair to whom? If you've got a buyer and a seller, then why not? If we can buy goods cheaply from other countries, that helps those of us in need here. We talk about the government having to give unemployment insurance or helping to give packages to people below a certain level. Well, if they could buy goods and services more cheaply from other places, now that helps them out. And a lot of people don't realize that basically a tariff is a hidden tax paid by the consumers. And we've got jobs now that we didn't even envision 10, 20, 30 years ago. You know, we didn't have Facebook when I was running for VP. And if you were to say, let me back up and say, back when the majority of the people were farmers and they were out there plowing their land, and then they made the combine. They made all of the equipment that we needed fewer farmers. People back then were saying, but what about all the farmers? Right. Now they won't have jobs. Well, now, 1-2% of our country are farmers, and most of that goes to other places anyway. So I would suggest that if we allow people to buy goods and services at a lower price, then we can have the kind of jobs that we want, and we can be more competitive on other things. So basically, protectionism hurts Americans, and also it makes us less competitive. So let me point out with the car industry in Detroit, we had a very inefficient car system. A lot of that was the unions. What would happen is, and by the way, if people want to voluntarily join unions and negotiate with their employers, great, I'm all for that. But what the government has done is they've stepped in and they've allowed employees to basically take their companies hostage. And what would happen is the companies in Detroit, the car companies, would come up with improvements. And they would say, okay, we want to do this to our car. And the unions would say, nope, in our contract, we only turn these 2 bolts. We're not allowed to pick up this and put this on the manufacturing line. Just ridiculous things. And so then Japan comes in and they show us, hey, guess what? You don't have to choose power windows, power steering, and automatic door locks. You get to get all 3 of them for a lower price. So by being competitive, that makes Americans more competitive with the world.
Do you worry about the hollowing out? And again, we're old enough to remember discussions about deindustrialization or post-industrial America, really dating from the early 70s, certainly the late 70s. The 90s, Bill Clinton had to talk a lot about that when free trade was an issue. But what about, the post-industrial Midwest or parts of the country that have been hollowed out, that had strong manufacturing jobs? How does a President Jorgensen help to revitalize those areas? What are the explicitly libertarian, uniquely libertarian policies that would help parts of the country that are suffering from economic decline or stagnation?
By getting out of the way. That's the best thing that a president can do. And if we look at policies, I remember reading a Wall Street Journal article, back in the 80s, in which there was somebody who lost his job in Michigan, car industry, moved to Houston, which was booming at the time. Oil, they even had a show called Dallas on TV because the area was, here's the central part. And he ended up moving back to Detroit. And what he told the interviewer was, you know what? I would rather be on unemployment in Detroit than have a job in Houston where it's humid. So what we have is the government kind of putting prices around or basically getting in the way of jobs. And what I would like to do is basically deregulate jobs so people can get them. And coronavirus and giving these cash payments. So in my travels after the nomination, I went to New Hampshire, great state. I spent a lot of time there as the VP candidate. And they have a monthly meeting at this wonderful restaurant, great food. And there was a group of us, granted, but we're in smaller groups. And it was the worst service I have ever seen at a restaurant. The 2 of us were completely finished with our meal. before the other person even got his food. In fact, we had to leave before the other person even got his food. Well, I found out from the person later that what happened was after coronavirus, after they allowed businesses to open, that they were paying people the unemployment, and all of his servers and cooks were making more money getting the unemployment check than they would be if they were working at the restaurant. So he only had like 3 people out of, 30 employees who came back, and he was having to train new people week after week after week. So here we've got the government getting in the way of somebody who had a very successful, has a great restaurant, and could just run it perfectly if the government would get out of the way.
What I was going to ask you a semi-joke question, because you had said New Hampshire's a great state, and then you kind of pissed on the service there. And I was going to ask you, I'm joking.
It wasn't the restaurant, exactly.
Oh, okay. Now you're just blame shifting. No, I was going to ask you what your least favorite state in the country was, but who is a bigger threat to the future of America as president, Donald Trump or Joe Biden?
I mean, do you want death by drowning or death by hanging? You've got 2 people who have basically never had to live under laws. One of the things that people forget is that our country was founded on the citizen statesman, that we have people go to Washington for a couple of months, and then they get to go home and live under those laws so they know what it's like. I don't think Joe Biden has ever lived under any law that he's ever passed. They are basically the elite of the elite. They pass laws and then they don't expect to be able to follow them. In fact, I wish I could remember who this was. This was before the 24-hour news channel, when if you saw something once on a Sunday talk show, a Sunday news show, you never saw it again. But after they passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, this was later, 70s, 80s, and they asked a Democratic congressperson, congressman or senator, well, so up his chest and said, I should be able to hire whoever I want. Again, they pass laws for the rest of us that they don't have to live under. So Trump and Biden do not have the consequences of their laws. They've got enough money, enough power that they'll be fine.
That's for sure. But I mean, what? Let me put it slightly different. What is the primary concern that you have about a second Trump term, and what kind of hell on earth would be brought into being by a Joe Biden presidency?
I would say they both share. Both of them want bigger spending. Trump has increased. He promised us smaller government. He's given us bigger government. We know that Joe Biden will give us bigger government. So they both have bigger government, and they're both war hawks. Trump promised to get us out of the wars, to bring the troops home, and he hasn't. And we know that Joe Biden is a war hawk. The Democratic Party completely shut out Tulsi Gabbard, who was the only pro-peace, anti-war candidate up there. And then she wasn't even allowed on the stage. So I say with both of them, we get more war, we get more spending. And enough said. What else could you do to make the country worse besides more war and more spending? You've got lives at stake, you've got safety at stake, and you've got money at stake.
I want to ask 2 kind of quick questions, and then I think we may either go to questions or get cut off. First, on the left, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, who are far to the left, even of what Hillary Clinton was in 2016. What is the appeal of that, and how do libertarians push back against a democratic socialist perspective, which seems to be very popular, especially among younger people and people of color?
Oh, sure. Well, basically, AOC is very young, and she comes in basically wanting to be Santa Claus, and we get all these things, and forgets that there's a price. That you don't just, she doesn't have money in her back pocket to pay for all these things. And so people hear, oh, I get this, this, and this, but they don't realize that not only are they paying for it, but they are paying extra money because now it's got to go through government to pay for it than if they had paid for it directly themselves.
What and on the right, there is, certainly a resurgence of populism under Trump, but also a kind of new nationalism, a conservative nationalism, nationalist conservatism. What concerns you most about that kind of rise among it seems younger conservatives and right people on the right of center?
With the nationals, basically, well, we hear Trump talk about make America great again. What I hear is make the American government great again, and that his followers are basically putting the ideals of the government rather than the ideals of the free citizens. So I would say that protectionism is the worst part of that.
We actually have negative time available to us now, Nick.
Oh, negative time is the best time. I just very quickly, can I just ask Joe, what will constitute success for your presidential campaign?
Well, if not victory, then growth. And we're already seeing that. So that may not happen, but people are finding out that the government has taken control of their lives. We saw that with the house arrest that we were all under with the pandemic. And that day is coming when people will be demanding freedom, and we're waiting for them.
Thank you, and I apologize, John. Thanks for offering this opportunity.
All right, that was wonderful, and thanks a lot to both Nick and Joe, and especially Nick. I only had one question prepared, and it was the last question you just asked. So now, all right, fine. You asked my question. I did appreciate that was a 45 minute interview, nearly entirely focused on policy, not politics, which I think is what you'd expect from libertarians. It's our strength.
And that may be also why we poll in single digits.
I was going to say, I think it's our strength, but sometimes it's our weakness.
Yes.
Anyway, thank you very much,